I recently gave a presentation at the Everything Fab Four Fest in New Jersey. This was a Beatles conference hosted by Beatles author and scholar Ken Womack. The focus of the conference was the album Rubber Soul. There were over 50 Beatles scholars giving presentations on all aspects of this album. I gave a presentation on Paul's bass lines because I see this album as the turning point for Paul McCartney as a bass player. Prior to the conference, I shared some of the slides from my presentation on Instagram, and there was a lot of interest in one particular slide, which showed a table that compared McCartney's bass lines on the Help album versus the Rubber Soul album. In the early years of the Beatles, McCartney was a solid, supportive, tasteful bass player, but he was relatively traditional. A lot of his bass lines from this era were root note bass lines or root fifth bass lines. Bass players spend a lot of our lives playing root fifth. It's just a standard kind of bass line in all kinds of music. Popular music, jazz, blues, rhythm and blues, Latin styles of music, country and western music, all kinds of music. And Paul McCartney played this root fifth kind of bass line a whole lot in the early years, up through the recording of the album Help in the first half of 1965. Musical development and creativity are difficult things to measure or quantify. But one thing I decided to do was look at McCartney's note choices on the Help album versus Rubber Soul. There was a predominance of root fifth bass patterns in the Beatles' music prior to Rubber Soul, but even aside from that specific pattern, the root and the fifth are anchors of a chord. They're strong, stable notes, but they aren't always the most interesting notes. So I counted the number of notes other than root and fifth per song, per minute, and per measure on Help and Rubber Soul. Note that I've included the song Wait with the Help tracks because it was recorded during those sessions, so it really belongs with that album, though it wasn't released until Rubber Soul. Also, there are 3 songs on Help that don't have bass at all. You've got to Hide Your Love Away, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday. There's no bass, those songs don't count. Now, I realize this is too much information to process, but we can zoom in on the results. And we see that, on Rubber Soul, McCartney plays notes other than root and fifth 1,247 times, compared to only 491 on Help. If we look at the averages per song, per minute, or per measure, we see similar numbers. In all 3 cases, Rubber Soul has over twice as many notes other than root and fifth than Help does. Now, this certainly isn't a complete picture, but it does tell us something about how much movement is in the bass lines on these 2 albums, and it shows us that he's relying on those traditional root fifth bass lines significantly less on Rubber Soul. I see Rubber Soul as being a turning point for McCartney as a bass player. This is when he got into really playing those melodic bass lines that he became famous for. We hear some examples of melodic bass lines earlier in his career, but Rubber Soul was where he became really inventive as a bass player. The bass lines on these 2 albums are night and day. McCartney went from playing solid, supportive, but traditional bass lines to playing bass lines that were conceptually something altogether new. But this change wasn't just that he could physically play more complicated things in the later years. We hear evidence in the early years where McCartney has chops. He had technical facility on his instrument. He could play fast passages, tricky fingerings. He could move around the instrument really well. So it wasn't that he could physically play more complex things. It was that he could imagine more complex things. His fingers didn't get more creative. His brain got more creative. There's a lot more Beatles and McCartney bass content on my YouTube channel, including bass covers of every song from the Rubber Soul album. Like, subscribe, thanks!